Hey, Becky.
Meow! Huples cat. Been off for a while because I've been going through grief, and I intended to talk about a paper anyway before I talked about grief, and I think it's important. The reason I want to talk about grief is that up until about January or February of 2020, each and every one of us had life plans, even if the plan was to do nothing much different. And the pandemic has very much altered our short-term life plans, and that's what everybody's been focusing on. But the truth of it is, it's actually going to, for almost everybody, if not everybody, change our long-term plans. And I wanted to talk about the stages of grief and what they mean in this kind of a context of an SHTF, because make no mistake, COVID-19 disease is causing a long-term, temporary SHTF. Obviously, things might occur on top of the pandemic that might make this a much longer event than initially it should have been. It should have been an event that would last about 18 months to 28 months, and it would have caused a lot of economic issues, and it would have caused a lot of death, but it would have been controlled and we would have been fine. Obviously, that's what I'm hoping will happen. So the traditional way of looking at it is Kubler-Ross, and that's been cast doubt upon by many people, but I just want to quickly talk about Kubler-Ross's stages. There's denial, which also includes disassociation, and then anger, then bargaining, despair, and acceptance. So the depression comes in with the despair aspect. Anger is scapegoating. It's interesting that most people I've seen online, including myself, are experiencing one or more of these stages, and that's an important factor. You can experience the stages of grief. Bye, Mr. Bear. You can experience the stages of grief in no particular order, and you can go back and forwards, you can be stuck in one, you can have more than one of the stages, and I'll explain that later on because I think that's an important explanation for many of the things that we're seeing around us right now at the beginning of June 2020, is that almost everybody, if not everybody, is in grief, and they're experiencing the stages of grief and acting or not acting based upon those stages of grief. So it's important for you to take a close look at yourself and your immediate family and people who are important to you, and try and figure out what's going on with them in terms of grief, because that will give you an insight into how they're going to act or not act if this temporary global SHTF caused by a pandemic increases or gets worse locally, nationally or internationally. What we've been mostly used to in the West is expected long-term dying processes, and the most common response to them is denial or acceptance. As a nurse, I've seen this all the time, where families absolutely deny that the patient's brain dead, or they absolutely deny they're going to die. That's why you get terms like they're a fighter, they will fight this, they're very strong. It doesn't matter how much you fight or how strong you are, each and every one of us will die. And acceptance would be, they've had a good life, they're not suffering now, I'm going to miss them, right? So, and you can bash between those two standpoints quite quickly, even in the middle of a sentence. So the major problem with grief, in terms of group dynamics, is people being at different stages of grief at the same time. So one person's stage, one person's reaction to the grief is different from the other person's, but they have to live together or they have to work together. So they can actually, the different stages of grief, from the inside of the stage, the other stages look ridiculous, or even worse, can make you angry, which is also a good way of letting out pain, but not a functional way. For us, I think it's more important to look at the sudden death. This is a sudden death of modern society. Modern society has died. It died in about February to March of 2020. Everything changed. It may or may not come back and be perfectly the same as it was before. Most of us think it won't. So initially, when you get this sudden grief, this sudden change, the most common response is despair. But it's not really a despair that's typical of long-term grief. It's more of a bewilderment, an inability to process. This is when you get normalcy bias. People continue to do the same things, even if you sat them down and talked to them, they go, well, I went to see my grandfather, but he wasn't there, right? So you pack up the lunch for your child who's dead. For example, when our dog Becky was found dead, that night when I fed Bear, I also got food out for Becky and put it on the side. I was bewildered by her sudden death. So the feeling of not knowing what to do, all your short-term, long-term, medium plans have been just destroyed. You can't conceive of them continuing because of the loss of the person, or the dog in my case. You also have no overwhelming passion at the time. The grief, usually in a sudden event, for most people doesn't actually appear to be grief. Initially it's more stunned, shock, repeating words, repeating phrases, repeating actions. They're in shock, and that's how I would put it, though this paper does not call it that. I would say it is shock, and shock can last years and can end up being psychiatric illness, or it can last a second, or it can last a few days. I typically switch to a no emotional response for about 2 to 6 hours. It's really helpful. I just don't have any emotional grief. It's like, oh, the dog's died, this is what we have to do. We have to cut it out of the bed it's suffocated in, we have to call the vet, we have to get the dog to go to the vet, we have to figure out what we're going to do with the dog at the vet, and it's a pandemic, so this might not be as easy as we think. So I have all of these logical processes, and it's very, very helpful, but then at a certain point after that, I collapse deeply. So Kitty has the response where she will actually embrace the sudden shock and get straight away into grieving. And so our grief processes don't align. And we both know this, and the way we cope with it is I tell Kitty, I'm really, really upset, I just don't feel it right now, but I will. And she knows me enough to know that that's true. Externally and internally, it looks like I don't give a damn. And that's a really dangerous thing, because, you know, for example, with the protesters that are going on all around the world about police brutality to ethnic minorities right now, they can't believe that other people are enraged. They're angry that their normalcy bias, you know, we don't like the cops, we go about our lives. Suddenly a man is executed on TV, and the coroner and the police chief and the governor of the state cover it up initially, and that's what they did. The authority figures like the president and other people, including Biden, initially don't focus on the act and how to prevent further acts. They focus on other things, and to a greater or larger extent, perhaps they're also experiencing a grief response of denial. From that point of view, I think it's important to look at this in terms of grief. What exactly is it? For example, a lot of people watching this know people or have unfortunately experienced sudden loss of employment, and that's or sudden decrease of employment. So they have plans based upon working for the next 10 to 20 years, or the next 5 years, or the next 6 months in my case, and suddenly, woof, externality happens, in this case a pandemic, and they lose their income. They lose their purpose in life to a large degree for a lot of people, because a lot of people's job is their purpose, which is a shame, because jobs end, life ends, the purpose of life is to live, right? But most people, they have this sudden grief response to the loss of employment. And even if you don't lose your employment in a depressed economy, and this is a depression that we're going through in terms of the economy, you actually feel threatened, and you actually feel grief for the loss of the stability and the certainty that everything's rosy, the stock market is rising, people are getting jobs. Yeah, there's an underclass that's not getting work, but we don't see them much because they don't live on my street and they don't shop in my shops. So suddenly you become part of the underclass, or you feel you might become part of the underclass. In American terms, the fear of welfare from the government, which is just the government giving you tax money back. But the fear of being dependent on the government for welfare can really cause a lot of grief response. And it's interesting what's happening, because a lot of people online are actually experiencing most of the grief stages. And I'll just reiterate Kubler-Ross's again and give you a few examples that I've seen online without naming names. This might be you. Some of these are me. So initially you get dissociation. You can't believe this is happening. We're actually still seeing this. People do not believe there is a pandemic. Right? There's clear evidence there is. Me and Kitty have nursed people with the pandemic. I've seen massive changes at work. I've seen a fair amount of death at work. Death rates are rising everywhere. Everything's shut down. But it's dissociative denial. They refuse to believe there's actually a pandemic. So what they do is they go into anger, and they look for scapegoats. It's a bioweapon from China, it's a bioweapon from America. Both of those things are global theories. It's a bioweapon for the New World Order. It is not really a pandemic. They're just pretending it's a pandemic. Everybody's dying of something other than COVID-19, but they're saying it's COVID-19 to fake a pandemic because they want to remove cash, or want to remove our guns, or want to remove our liberties, or whatever their personal bias is. And they see evidence for that. And online, whatever you believe, you can find strong evidence for, right? I mean, it isn't evidence, it isn't fact, it isn't reality, but you cannot but help see your own personal bias be amplified back to you, which is why you absolutely have to always look at alternative viewpoints all the time. The more certain you are of reality, the more certain you are of a truth. For example, if you truly believe Donald Trump has done a great job with the pandemic, you are going to look for, find and see strong evidence of that. If you truly believe he's done a terrible job, you're going to find a lot easier evidence that he's done that. The truth is somewhat in between. However, I'm not going to get into his response to the pandemic because mostly it's been bad right from the beginning, and it's pretty obvious to me that if you ideologically support Donald Trump but you believe he did a good job with the pandemic, you aren't actually looking at reality from a real point of view. He has made major errors, and he continues to make major errors in terms of pandemic response that are not based on anything ideological or party lines, but actually what he should have done as a leader of a great country faced with a sudden global pandemic. He didn't do a lot of things right, he said a lot of wrong things, and he continued to not listen to scientific advice and promoted inaccurate and in fact dangerous advice, and is in fact in June 2020 still doing it in terms of the pandemic. The next phase is bargaining. You bargain that I won't personally die because I've got N95s, I'm going to be careful with my money, I'm going to be okay, yes, this is going to be really bad, but if I wash my hands, if I wear a face mask, it's okay for me to go to the shops more than once a week. That again is a bargaining thing. If I give up something, I will be protected. And you see that a lot of times with religion. The bargaining aspect of religion, where if I pray, if I believe in Jesus or Muhammad, are you allowed to say Muhammad without getting burned to death? I don't know. Anyway, so if you believe in a deity, you believe that by believing in the deity, you are going to gain immortality, or you're going to gain personal wealth even on the planet. And that's fine. But in terms of what we're faced with a global pandemic, the bargaining is much more, I believe that X person is actually telling me the absolute truth, and I will follow them and suspend my critical faculties when they're talking. As I've said before, and I'll say again, nobody online has a clue. This is a novel virus. We don't know where it's going. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there'll be a second wave, though that's highly likely. We don't know when the second wave will be. I will be shocked rigid if it doesn't happen until November, but that's just my personal viewpoint looking at history. There's a whole bunch of not knowns. You know, the faith in, the bargaining in, we will get a vaccine. We are brilliant, we are rich, we are incredibly diverse, we can get a vaccine. Whereas history tells us to get a coronavirus vaccine that is safe and effective would be amazing. It would be a miracle. So if you want a vaccine that's safe and effective and works, and you want it within the next 3 months, start praying to your deity, because I don't think humanity can provide you that. So there's been work done on grief and grief response in major disasters. I think that's an important aspect of what's going on, because this is a major disaster. Obviously, if you don't believe COVID-19 exists because it's a hoax, you need to examine why you believe that, but it does exist, and it isn't a hoax, and it is a major disaster in all of our lives, all across the globe, in many, many different ways, because grief hits people differently, and our expectations for our future have been altered differently based upon our perceptions and also the reality of what's happening locally, nationally and globally. So of all the 5 phases of grief, and there are more than 5, and you may or may not have one, you may, etc., etc., the one that's most associated with major disasters is disassociation. And I think it's really important to focus on the disassociation aspect, because I'm still seeing that in a lot of videos online and a lot of comments online, is the disassociation from the... So disassociation is a bit like denial, right? So they're similar and actually are conjoined, but are actually separate impacting events. Disassociation is also a bit like despair. The main characteristic of disassociation in grief response is the fact that you do not feel and are able to do anything. You feel flat, you feel nothing. So you're not actually doing anything. You might be doing repetitive tasks you would normally do that may or may not make any sense. But the main thing you have is you just don't feel able to engage. I think a lot of people have had a huge amount of disassociation, and I know I have, where you just don't feel able to actually cope with or deal with the issue, so you just don't. The main reason disassociation is different from the 5 stages of Kubler-Ross's grief process is the fact there is no emotional response. You don't actually have an emotion to it. All the other stages there is emotion going on. This one, dissociation, you don't really feel much. So this is characterized with, I just want to go back to how it was before this happened. This is characterized at the moment by, I just want things to open. I just want my kids to be able to go to school again. I just want to be able to go and to the restaurant again, and I don't see why I can't. So it's not denial. You know factually things have changed. You can't send your kids to school. You know that the pandemic's real, but you just want it to go back to the way it was. What you're denying, what you in disassociation, is the ability to replan, and that's critical in any SHTF or any major event or any major loss. You've lost the ability to replan based upon the new reality. You just want things to go back to the way they were, so you don't have to replan for a future that has now become radically different. Disassociation is a denial of planning for the future rather than denial of the facts. Denial is denial of the event. So there is no planning for the future based upon the new reality because you do not believe the reality of the event that's happened. Two different things. Disassociation, I think, is the common one people have, whereas our ability to make plans for our future have been radically altered by external events, and you are grieving for the loss of that potential future that you had expected and planned for, but at the same time you're disassociated because you're not actually actively planning for the future. Now, people have gardens. I have a garden and I make my garden, and I replant my garden based upon food shortages in the fall and the winter and the spring coming up, based upon what I think might be the outcome from the pandemic and the Great Depression it's going to trigger, and a few other factors which have happened faster than I expected. But I'm still somewhat disassociated. I haven't dug up my front lawn, I haven't dug up my back lawn, I haven't planted a massive amount of crops. I've done a little bit as lip service to a plan to feed myself if the stores collapse. The major issue is scapegoating. Anger, scapegoating. You blame the Chinese, China, you blame the government, you blame everything. Like rioting's happening in your city, so you blame the people who are rioting, but you make no efforts to understand why they're rioting, and you don't blame anybody that caused the rioting, you just blame the rioters. So that's one of the things people do, is they scapegoat. They blame the government for not doing this, they blame the people around them for not doing this. You see this a lot in SHTF preparations, where people disgustingly say, I'll just shoot my neighbours, they made no plans, they had the opportunity, they didn't, I don't care, they're going to die, it's their fault. I think one of the common ones is blaming liberals, and that always amuses me. When you have a government in power that's not liberal in the United States, but all the things that the government's doing wrong is caused by the liberals, you have to kind of wonder about the cognitive dissonance there, given the fact that the Republicans are in charge, very much in charge, but they scapegoat the Senate because it's liberal, if you like to call the NC liberal. I do not, the neo-capitalist right wing, but they blame them for X, Y, and Z rather than blame the president and the House and their state governor for dealing with it. Like everything that's wrong in America, you would think from some things online, is only because of DNC governors. All the RNC states just like utopia there, I guess. Whereas in fact it's the system and people's ability to work within the system dealing with an externality called a pandemic and then the economic collapse that is actually wrong. It's not the ideology of the people in charge, so they may alter things differently based upon ideology, but the actual problem that you're experiencing, the grief you're experiencing, is not caused by that. It's caused by an entirely different thing. It's caused by the pandemic, not by the ideology of the government leader. Thanks for listening to this. My main message here is everybody is suffering from grief because of the loss of our normal lives, because of a pandemic. How we cope with that grief is how humans cope with grief. But if you find yourself scapegoating, if you find yourself being angry, if you find yourself in denial to the point where you're actually increasing your own personal risk, that's not great. That's not great at all. So watch out for that. Watch out for the mechanisms and methods that you're using to deal with an ongoing and evolving pandemic, and use the knowledge that use what I've said in this video to have a retrospective look at how you've been coping and how you are expecting to cope and the things you're doing. Are you in denial? Are you focusing on bioweaponry, disassociation? Are you scapegoating this, blaming China? What are you doing? Everything you should be doing should be coping with, learning to live with the grief that you're experiencing, and at the same time doing it in ways that allow you to keep living safely as possible. So that's it from me. Remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today, and in a pandemic, tomorrow will always be worse than today until after the peak. And we're not out of the first peak yet. Toodles.